The chandeliers glittered like 1,000 captured stars, each one spilling gold light across the marble floors of the ballroom. Music swelled in waves, violins and piano sweeping together into something so elegant it felt unreal. Every corner of the gala hummed with power, men in sharp tuxedos shaking hands with smiles that hid sharpened knives, women in gowns that shimmered like liquid fire. The air carried perfume, expensive wine, and the faint metallic chill of fear that came whenever the Mafia elite gathered in one place. Estella clutched the small stack of ivory place cards to her chest as though they could shield her. Her uniform, a pressed black blazer, plain white shirt, shoes she had borrowed from her friend Geneva made her blend into the background. That was the point. She wasn't here to be noticed. She was here to survive the night, to scrape together just enough wages to cover her mother's medicine and maybe a fraction of the rent looming over her head. Invisible. That was the goal. She glided between tables, eyes lowered, placing name cards at each empty setting. Waiters darted past her, balancing trays of champagne and oysters. The guests glittered like living jewels, their laughter too loud, their conversations hushed in corners where deals were struck. Estella's heart beat a little faster with every brush of silk and diamond against her shoulder. She kept repeating silently, "Just a few more hours. Just a little longer." Her hands shook once when she almost dropped a card. She gripped it tighter, whispered her mother's name under her breath, and forced herself to keep moving. If she broke, there would be no money. If she faltered, she might be dismissed. At the far end of the room, seated like a king in his throne, was Carson. Everyone knew who he was. They didn't speak his name loudly, but the entire room bent around him as if his gravity commanded the air itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit tailored so perfectly it seemed sculpted to his frame. His dark hair was slicked back, his expression a mask carved from steel. People approached him with care, voices trembling even when they tried to sound bold. He was the man whose empire stretched across cities, the one who decided which businesses thrived and which burned. Estella hadn't meant to look at him, but she did. And in that instant, he looked back. Her breath caught, a sharp hitch that made her chest ache. His eyes were cold, storm gray, piercing through the distance as though no one else in the crowded hall mattered. She tried to drop her gaze, to retreat into invisibility again, but something about the way he stared held her captive. It wasn't the kind of look she'd ever received before. Not the careless glance of a man sizing up a servant. Not the dismissive sweep that brushed her aside as background noise. It was sharp, deliberate, as if he saw through the plain uniform, through the nerves that made her fingers tremble, through the life she had hidden from everyone else. Estella forced herself to turn away, to finish placing the last card at the table nearest his. She bent her head low, muttered, "Excuse me," when she brushed past two laughing women in sapphire gowns and tried to vanish into the noise. But Carson did not let her. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting lazily on the crystal glass of bourbon at his elbow. His men flanked him, shadows with hard eyes. One of them said something low, but Carson ignored him. He was still watching her, gaze unwavering. The band shifted songs. A waiter stumbled near the stage. The atmosphere flickered, but then it stilled again, because Carson moved. He lifted his hand, a subtle command that sliced through the music and chatter like a blade. "Bring her to my table." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. His voice, low and deliberate, carried across the space with terrifying clarity. The music faltered. Laughter died. Heads turned like a flock of birds startled into flight. Every pair of eyes zeroed in on her. Estella froze, heat crawling up her neck. Her knees threatened to give out beneath her, and she gripped the stack of place cards as though it could keep her from collapsing. The women nearest her exchanged whispers edged with venomous envy. The men smirked knowingly. Someone hissed, "Why her?" The usher, chosen. Her pulse hammered so loud she could barely hear. She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear into the kitchens and never be seen again. yet her feet betrayed her, refusing to move. A waiter approached hesitantly, bowing to Carson, then motioned toward her. "You, come with me." She shook her head once, lips parting to protest, but her voice had abandoned her. Carson didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. His eyes locked on hers, steady, merciless, daring her to refuse. Something flickered beneath the ice of his stare, something she couldn't decipher. It wasn't lust, not the vulgar hunger she'd seen in other men. It wasn't disdain either. It was recognition. A strange pull, as though he had been waiting for her. Estella's stomach twisted. She clutched the cards tighter, whispered her mother's name again, and forced her legs forward. Each step across the marble floor sounded like the toll of a bell, echoing through the cavernous hall. She felt the heat of 100 gazes burn into her back. Jealousy, curiosity, malice. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath as she walked. Toward him, the lion's den. Carson's men shifted as she approached, eyes sharp, scanning her as though she were already a threat. She barely noticed. Her vision tunneled until only he remained. He didn't smile. He didn't speak again. He simply watched her, that same unreadable expression carved across his face. When she stopped at the edge of his table, her breath shallow, her hands trembling, he leaned forward slightly. For one unbearable moment, it felt as though the whole world had narrowed to the space between them. And Estella knew, whatever had drawn his gaze, whatever reason lurked behind his command, her life would never return to what it had been before this night. The Usher had been chosen. What would you do if the most feared man in the room suddenly chose you? The apartment was small, hardly more than a single room with a narrow kitchen corner and a sagging sofa pressed against one wall. Yet for Estella, it was the center of her universe, because it held the person she had sacrificed everything for, her mother. Each morning began with the same quiet ritual. Estella would rise before the sun, pad barefoot across the cold floor, and check her mother's breathing before anything else. Some mornings it rattled, shallow and weak, and fear would lance through her chest. Other mornings it was steadier, softened by the medicine she stretched their pennies to buy. Her mother, once strong and lively, had been reduced to fragile bones and trembling hands. Illness had stolen her strength, leaving Estella as the sole provider. She had taken every job offered to her: cleaning, waiting tables, stocking shelves, and finally ushering at glittering galas where she did not belong. The pay was better than most work a girl like her could get. But the danger clung to those halls like perfume. She told herself she didn't mind. Every aching footstep, every plastered smile, every coin dropped into her palm meant another day her mother lived. That was enough. That had to be enough. But sometimes when Estella stood in those grand ballrooms watching diamonds sparkle and silk gowns glide across marble floors, she felt the sharp edge of envy. Not for the wealth itself, she had long accepted she would never belong there, but for the ease those people carried, the assurance that tomorrow was promised to them. For Estella, tomorrow was always a question. Carson never lived with questions. He lived with answers, sharp and final. To the city, he was more than a man. He was the shadow cast across every deal, the ghost whispered about in bars, the name that froze enemies mid-step. He had built his empire not with reckless fire, but with cold calculation. Others in his world drank too deeply, gambled too foolishly, indulged until weakness destroyed them. Carson never did. He was discipline in a tailored suit, a fortress of ice. When rivals crossed him, they didn't vanish in chaos. They were dismantled with such precision, it made others hesitate before moving against him. His wealth stretched farther than most could imagine. His power, rooted in fear and respect, was unshakable. And yet, for all his strength, he was untouchable in more than reputation. He did not let people close. His men feared him, but none could claim to know him. Women wanted him, but none stayed long enough to peel back his mask. He carried the kind of solitude only a man who had chosen isolation could bear. Cold, dangerous, unyielding. That was Carson. Geneva never tired of reminding Estella how reckless her choices were. They met often in a corner cafe, sipping weak coffee from chipped mugs. Geneva's hair was as wild as her temper, her words cutting but threaded with love. "You should quit doing these jobs," Geneva said one morning, eyes flashing. "These galas, you think they're just rich people drinking wine, but you don't see what's underneath. The men who run them aren't the type you can brush shoulders with and walk away safe." Estella stirred her coffee slowly, watching the ripples. "It pays better than scrubbing kitchens. And I don't have time to be picky." Geneva leaned forward, her voice dropping low. "Money isn't worth it if it gets you noticed in the wrong way. You don't belong in their world, Stell, and you don't want them pulling you into it." Estella's lips parted to argue, but the truth lodged heavy in her chest. Geneva was right. Those places were dangerous. Yet her mother's coughs echoed in her memory, sharp reminders of why she couldn't walk away. She finally whispered, "I don't have a choice." Geneva's hand softened over hers. "Promise me you'll be careful." Estella nodded, though in her heart she wondered how careful one could really be, standing at the edge of fire. Estella's life was a constant balancing act, between working herself to exhaustion and keeping her mother alive, between wanting to vanish and being unable to refuse the money the galas offered. Every night she pinned her hair back, buttoned the stiff blazer, and told herself she would slip unnoticed through those glittering halls. Invisible. That was her shield. But shields crack. And when Carson's storm-gray eyes would one day cut through the crowd and find her, Estella's careful world of sacrifice and survival would tilt into something far more dangerous. Estella is defined by desperation, her mother's illness, her endless sacrifices, her willingness to step into dangerous spaces just to keep them alive. Carson is defined by coldness, his reputation as untouchable, his discipline, his refusal to be weakened by closeness. But when he notices her, truly notices her, their worlds shift. For Estella, survival demands invisibility, yet Carson's gaze tears that shield away. For Carson, power demands distance, yet Estella's fear and defiance cut through his walls. Two lives built on opposite truths now circle dangerously close, bound by a pull neither asked for. The music had returned after Carson's command, but the rhythm of the evening had changed. Estella felt it in every stare that followed her across the ballroom. She was no longer invisible. She had been chosen, summoned into orbit around a man whose very name made people lower their voices. Carson did not let her slip back into the shadows. A chair was pulled for her, too close to his, and when she hesitated, his gaze pinned her into place. Reluctantly, she sat. The polished wood beneath her felt colder than marble, the eyes of the entire hall searing into her back. Carson leaned toward her, his voice low, unhurried. "Relax. You're trembling." "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, forcing her eyes to the glass of water in front of her rather than his face. "You're here because I said so." His words carried no apology, no explanation, only finality, as if his will was law. Estella's fingers curled around her lap. Her instinct was to flee, but every time her gaze flicked to the doors, she caught the shadows of his men waiting. Guards who looked like any moment they'd block her path. She was trapped at his table, a mouse seated beside the lion. And yet, Carson didn't touch her. He didn't leer. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply kept her near, as if daring the world to question him. They did. Pierce was the first. He entered with the arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable, his white tuxedo stark against the dark suits around him. His smile was too smooth, his eyes too sharp, and his steps carried him directly toward Carson's table. "Carson," he drawled, as though greeting an old friend. "And who is this?" His gaze slid to Estella, lingering too long, the smirk deepening. "New company? How unexpected." Estella's stomach knotted. The way he looked at her felt different than Carson's gaze, hungrier, mocking, as if she were a prize left unguarded. She straightened, gripping her hands beneath the table. Carson's jaw tightened. "Walk away, Pierce." But Pierce only chuckled, tilting his glass toward Estella. "Funny. Everyone knows you don't keep guests at your side. Cold as stone, that's what they say. And yet..." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so that only they could hear. "You've found a weakness. Interesting?" Estella's breath hitched. "Weakness?" The word sliced through her chest like ice. Carson's hand shifted, resting on the table, his fingers curling as though resisting the urge to snap. "Careful," he said, voice soft but deadly. Pierce smirked again and straightened. "Of course. Wouldn't want to upset the balance. Enjoy your evening." His retreat was slow, deliberate, a trail of whispers following in his wake. Estella couldn't breathe. She felt the stares even more now, curious, jealous, predatory. Pierce's words had turned her into something dangerous, not just for herself, but for Carson too. She leaned closer, her voice breaking. "What does he mean? Why would he call me that?" Carson's eyes slid to hers, calm and unreadable. "Because in this world, if anyone knows what matters to you, they'll use it against you." Her heart pounded painfully. "But I don't matter to you." The silence stretched. His gaze did not waver. "Don't I?" he said at last, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. The night dragged forward, every moment thick with tension. Waiters hovered, their eyes flicking nervously toward the table where Estella sat. Women in jeweled gowns whispered behind manicured hands, their envy sharp as knives. Men glanced with calculating interest, as though measuring the worth of the usher who had caught Carson's eye. Carson ignored them all. He spoke occasionally to his men, short commands that kept the evening smooth, but he never let Estella drift. Each time she shifted as if to stand, his voice or his gaze anchored her back down. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "Why me?" she asked in a whisper, her voice raw. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he poured himself another glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light. "Do you know why people survive in this world?" he asked. She shook her head, throat tight. "Because they're protected," he said simply. Then his gaze locked onto hers, sharp as a blade. "And tonight I decided you would be." Her breath caught. "I didn't ask for protection." His lips curved, not quite a smile. "No one ever does." The words unsettled her more than comforted. She looked away, her heart hammering. Protection, from him, felt too much like a cage. Later, when the gala wound down and the guests drifted away into waiting cars, Estella lingered by the exit, her hands clutching her bag. She prayed he would forget her, let her leave into the night as though none of it had happened. But Carson's car was waiting outside, his men at its doors. One of them stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "The boss wants you driven home." Estella's mouth went dry. "I can walk." The man didn't argue. He simply opened the door. Inside, Carson's silhouette waited, sharp against the city lights. Estella hesitated. Every instinct screamed that stepping into that car meant surrendering the little freedom she still clung to. And yet, she remembered Pierce's gaze, the whispers, the word weakness echoing like a threat in her ears. If she walked away, what would stop them from following? Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Slowly, she slid into the car. The door shut with a heavy finality, the sound of a choice she hadn't meant to make. Inside, Carson sat in silence, his gaze fixed forward. Only when the car pulled away did he speak. "You don't understand yet," he said, voice low. "By being seen with me, you've already been marked. They'll come for you, Estella. Protection isn't a gift. It's survival." She turned toward him, her pulse loud in her ears. "But I didn't ask for this. And what will your protection cost me?" For the first time, his storm-gray eyes flicked to hers, unblinking. Everything. Do you believe protection from someone dangerous can ever feel safe? The hum of the engine filled the silence as the car glided through the city, its tinted windows cutting her off from the world outside. Estella pressed her back against the leather seat, clutching her bag like a shield. Every streetlight they passed threw a shifting glow across Carson's sharp profile, jaw strong, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Finally, unable to endure the tension, she whispered, "Why me? Why are you doing this?" Carson turned his head, storm gray eyes locking on her. For once, there was no cold steel in his gaze, no mask of indifference. He studied her as though the question itself mattered, as though she deserved an answer. "Because I like you," he said simply. His voice was low, steady, but there was no mockery in it. "And because for the first time in years, I can see myself settling down. Not with any of them." His chin tilted toward the memory of jeweled women at the gala. "But with you." The air seemed to collapse around her. Estella blinked, certain she had misheard. "With me?" Carson leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Do you want the truth?" Her throat tightened. "Yes." "You were afraid of me," he said. "And yet you didn't run. You looked me in the eye when everyone else bows their heads. That kind of defiance. I can't ignore it. You're not like the others." Estella shook her head, a soft, incredulous laugh escaping her. "That's not a reason, that's—" She broke off, struggling for air. "You don't even know me." Carson's lips curved, not quite a smile. "Then I'll learn you." Her pulse stumbled. The car slowed as it pulled up outside her building, the shabby brick standing in stark contrast to the polished vehicle. Carson's driver glanced back, waiting for orders. Carson leaned closer. "Think about what I've said, Estella. You don't have to answer now. But understand this, your life is no longer the same. My world has already touched you, and once it does, there's no going back." Life proved him right. The days that followed blurred into something surreal. Carson's car waited outside her building every evening, his men standing guard near her door as if her modest apartment were a palace in need of protection. She resisted at first, arguing, insisting she didn't need him, but Carson was immovable. Each protest slipped off him like rain on stone. Soon she found herself in his world whether she wanted to be or not. Lavish dinners in restaurants where chandeliers glittered above, guarded cars that ferried her from one place to another, and men with guns who bowed their heads when Carson entered a room. The opulence was dizzying. Crystal glasses, silk tablecloths, plates of food she couldn't name. She sat beside Carson, dressed in gowns delivered to her door, and wondered if everyone could see how much she didn't belong. But in the quiet hours, when the guards lingered outside and the night softened around them, Carson shed fragments of the armor he wore. They sat together in his study, a fire glowing in the hearth, glasses of untouched bourbon on the table. "You don't smile much," Estella said once, surprised at her own boldness. Carson leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting in the firelight. "Smiles are invitations. In my world, invitations are dangerous." "Maybe," she murmured, "or maybe they're human." For a moment, silence stretched. Then, almost imperceptibly, his mouth curved. Not the sharp smile he gave rivals, not the cold mask he wore in public. Something smaller, real. It was in those moments she glimpsed the man beneath the boss. The boy who had once lived before power hardened him. He told her fragments of his past, the betrayal that taught him never to trust, the blood that built his empire. He didn't tell her everything, but he told her enough for her to feel the weight he carried. And with each shard of truth, Estella felt herself drawn closer, even when she fought it. Andre noticed. Carson's right hand, loyal and watchful, cornered her one evening as she stepped out onto the balcony for air. The city stretched below, glittering in the dark. Andre leaned against the railing, his expression grave. "You think you're safe because he's watching you," Andre said quietly. "But you're not." Estella's heart stumbled. "What do you mean?" No one gets close to Carson without getting burned, Andre continued. His eyes were sharp, but there was no malice in them, only warning. He protects what he wants, fiercely, but his enemies see everything. They'll come for you just to hurt him. Estella gripped the railing, the metal cold against her palms. I didn't ask for this. Andre's voice softened. Neither did he. But it doesn't matter. You're in it now. The threats began days later. It started with a note slipped under her door. You don't belong to him. Leave or bleed. Carson's men found it before she did, but he showed her anyway, placing the paper in her trembling hands. Her eyes widened. They'll kill me. Carson's gaze was steel. Not while I breathe. The words should have comforted her, but instead they sent a shiver down her spine. Protection from Carson was its own kind of prison, iron bars dressed in velvet. When she left his side at dinners, men watched her too closely. Women whispered venom as she passed. Rivals circled like vultures, their eyes gleaming with the knowledge that she was no longer invisible. Carson grew possessive in response. He kept her close, his hand firm at the small of her back, his voice low when others dared speak to her. Once, when a rival lingered too near, Carson leaned in and murmured something in his ear that sent the man paling, retreating without a word. It should have frightened her, the way Carson staked his claim. And it did. But beneath the fear was something else, an ache she didn't want to name. Because in his presence, even surrounded by danger, she felt seen, not invisible, not forgotten. Seen. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. One night, as they sat together in his car after another endless dinner, Estella turned to him, exhaustion written across her face. This isn't safety, she said softly. This is a storm, and I'm caught in the middle. Carson's hand tightened on the wheel. He didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. A storm can destroy, or it can shield. Which one it becomes depends on where you stand. She swallowed hard. And if I stand with you? At last he looked at her, his storm-gray eyes burning. Then you'll never fall. Her chest ached. She should have pulled away, should have reminded herself of Geneva's warning, Andre's caution, the threats piling at her door. But instead, she sat in the silence of that promise, her heart betraying her with every rapid beat. The storm had already claimed her. Would you let yourself fall for someone whose protection feels like a cage? Or would you run, even if running meant facing danger alone? The night had ended late, the echoes of the gala still lingering in Estella's bones. She stood before her mirror now in the quiet of her apartment, staring at the reflection of a girl she barely recognized. Hair pinned in ways she never wore it, skin touched by powders and paints Carson's people had insisted she use. The dress draped across her like a costume, and yet behind her eyes there was something raw, unsettled. She couldn't forget his words in the car. I like you. I could see myself settling down. With you. Her chest ached at the memory. It was impossible. Absurd. Men like Carson didn't settle, and certainly not with girls like her. And yet he had said it with such finality it left no room for doubt. The revelation didn't come until later, when she overheard Andre. It was in Carson's penthouse, an opulent fortress high above the city. She had been left alone in the study, the fire throwing shadows across shelves lined with leather-bound books. She tried to steady her breathing, to pretend this life wasn't swallowing her whole. Then she heard them, Carson and Andre, their voices carrying from the hall. She deserves to know, Andre said. She doesn't need to know, Carson replied, his voice low, clipped. Carson, you had her background checked before the gala. You don't just point at people, you chose her. Estella froze, her breath catching. Background checked? Days before? Her stomach twisted. He hadn't simply noticed her across the ballroom. He had been watching her, investigating her. Why? Andre pressed. Carson's silence stretched, heavy and damning. Then at last, his voice came, softer. Because I saw her weeks ago, at the cafe on 7th. She didn't look at me like the others. She just looked through me. No fear, no worship, nothing, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Estella stumbled back from the door, her chest tightening. The cafe. She remembered that day now, hurrying out with Geneva, balancing coffee cups, nearly colliding with a man she hadn't looked at twice. She hadn't known it was him. Her knees trembled. She had thought his gaze at the gala was chance, fate even. But it wasn't. He had sought her out. When Carson entered the study minutes later, she was waiting. "You had me followed." The words came sharp, cutting. Carson's steps slowed. His eyes narrowed. "You overheard? You knew who I was before the gala. You didn't just pick me. You—" Her voice broke. "Why? Why would you do that?" Carson closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "Because I don't leave anything to chance." Her chest heaved. "That's not an answer." His eyes locked on hers, storm gray, unflinching. "Because when I first saw you, I felt something I couldn't explain. And I don't gamble with unknowns. I needed to know who you were before I let you close." Her throat tightened. "So I was an investigation, a file on your desk." "You were more," Carson said, stepping closer. "You are more." The heat of him filled the room, overwhelming. Estella stepped back until her shoulders hit the wall. "You don't get to decide that. You don't get to make me into something I'm not." Carson's jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "Then tell me what you are, Estella, because I see a woman who doesn't bow, a woman who fights even when she's afraid. That's why I chose you." Her heart thundered, traitorous in its yearning. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the gravity pulling her closer. But the betrayal cut too deep. "You should have told me." Silence stretched. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. The tension crackled, heavy and dangerous, until Estella pushed past him, her breath ragged. "I can't do this." Estella slipped out of the house quietly, the weight of Carson's world pressing too heavily on her shoulders. Just one moment alone, she told herself, just one breath without the eyes of his men watching, without Carson's storm-gray gaze burning into her. She sank onto a bench, the wine trembling in her hand. She had barely lifted it to her lips when a voice slid from the shadows. "You look lost." Her heart lurched. She turned sharply and froze. Pierce stepped into the light with a smile too smooth to be kind. His tuxedo was still crisp, his eyes gleaming with something sharper, hungrier. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice tight. "Neither should you," he countered easily, circling her slowly like a predator sizing prey. "Carson Vale doesn't keep women at his side. Not until you. Do you know what that makes you?" Estella swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening around the glass. "A mistake." Pierce chuckled, the sound low and cruel. "No, a weapon." Her chest tightened painfully. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so it licked like smoke against her ear. "You want freedom, safety. Walk away from him. I can give you that. No guards, no threats, no being used as a pawn in his endless war." She shook her head, her voice trembling but steady. "And if I say no?" His smile sharpened, all charm stripped away. "Then you'll learn the hard way that no one stands beside Carson Vale and survives." The shadows swallowed him again as swiftly as he'd appeared, leaving Estella breathless, her glass shaking in her hand. And for the first time, she knew with chilling certainty, Pierce's eyes were on her, always. By the time she was back, and Carson returned to her that night, Estella's heart was a storm. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he hadn't told her the truth. She wanted to lean into him, to trust the fierce promise in his eyes. She wanted both, and neither. He reached for her hand, his touch steady, grounding. Whatever Pierce said to you, forget it. She pulled her hand back. You don't understand. He's right. I'm already caught in your war, Carson, and I don't even know if you'll fight for me when it matters. Carson's jaw tightened, his storm gray eyes blazing. You're not a pawn, you're mine, and I don't let anyone take what's mine. Her breath caught. The words should have terrified her. Instead, they left her trembling with something far more dangerous. Hope. Estella realized the truth. She hadn't been chosen by chance, but by Carson's deliberate hand. The betrayal cut deep, but so did the pull between them. Pierce's temptation dangled freedom before her, yet it came wrapped in poison. And beneath it all, she understood. Her fate was no longer her own. She was tied to Carson Vale, to his empire, to his war, and there was no going back. If you discovered the person who claimed to protect you had chosen you long before you noticed them, would you see it as love or as betrayal? The night air was heavy with the promise of rain, thick clouds swallowing the moon as Carson's convoy threaded through the city streets. Estella sat in the back of the car beside him, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Carson's silence had become familiar. Sharp, weighted, a barrier he rarely lowered outside the privacy of his study. Tonight, though, there was a tension in the air that made her chest ache. His jaw was clenched, his phone buzzing every few minutes with messages Andre read aloud in clipped tones. Something was wrong. She opened her mouth to ask, but the words never left her lips. The world exploded. A blast tore through the night, deafening and blinding. The car jolted sideways, metal shrieking as tires screamed. Estella was thrown against the seat, her breath ripped from her lungs. Gunfire shattered the windows in the lead car, sparks raining across the dark street. The convoy dissolved into chaos. Screams, orders shouted, the thundering echo of bullets. "Get her out!" Carson roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Andre's door flew open, and hands yanked Estella into the cold night air. She stumbled, the acrid stench of smoke clawing at her throat. A black van screeched into view, doors flung wide. Before she could scream, rough arms wrapped around her, dragging her backward. "Carson!" she cried, her voice raw. She saw him then, storm-gray eyes blazing, firing into the shadows, cutting down men like a force of nature. He turned toward her, his hand outstretched, and then the van door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed her. The world became rope and silence. Her wrists ached where they were bound, her throat dry from screaming until her voice broke. The blindfold pressed too tight against her eyes, turning everything into suffocating black. She could hear their voices, men's laughter, harsh and cruel, circling her like predators. "Doesn't look like much," one sneered. "Boss says she matters," another replied. "She's the weakness." A third voice chuckled. "Carson won't come for her. He's too smart for that. She's expendable." Estella's chest heaved, fear tightening like a fist. Expendable. The word echoed in her head, tearing through the fragile hope she clung to. They were right, weren't they? Carson's world was built on control, on cold calculation. Would he risk everything for her? A girl who had been nothing before he decided to point at her? Tears burned her eyes beneath the blindfold. She whispered her mother's name, clinging to it like a prayer. Maybe Geneva had been right all along. Maybe this was the fire she couldn't escape. Across the city, Carson was losing his grip. The warehouse stank of blood and smoke, bodies still cooling on the ground. Andre paced, his face drawn tight with worry as Carson stood amid the wreckage, his gun still smoking. His men waited at a distance, silent, wary. They had never seen him like this, storm-gray eyes wild, his mask of control shattered. "She's gone," Andre said carefully, his voice quiet. Carson turned sharply, his jaw rigid. "Find her." "We're trying," Andre pressed. But I think Pierce planned this. He's always been calculating, and now he's found the crack he needed. You let her close. You let them see. And now he's using her against you. Carson's fist slammed into the table, splintering the wood. Don't lecture me. Andre didn't flinch. Someone has to. You've built an empire on discipline, Carson, on control, but this girl, this Usher, she's unraveling you. And Pierce knows it. Carson's breath came ragged, his chest heaving. He thought of Estella, her wide, defiant eyes, the way her voice trembled when she argued with him, the way her presence cracked through the walls he had built. She was more than a weakness. She was the first thing in years that had made him feel alive. And now she was gone. Then let him know, Carson said, his voice a growl. Let him know exactly what happens when someone takes what's mine. In the dark room where they kept her, Estella curled against the ropes, her body aching from the rough treatment. Hours had passed. She didn't know how many. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, fear clawed at her chest, but worse was the silence. No Carson, no rescue. You really think he'll come for you? One of her captors taunted, yanking the blindfold away. The sudden light made her eyes sting. Carson Vale doesn't bleed for anyone. You're just bait. Estella swallowed hard, forcing her trembling chin up. Then why are you so afraid of me? She whispered. The man blinked, startled, before snarling and shoving her back. But her words echoed in her own chest, stronger than she expected. She was terrified. Yes, but not broken. Not yet. Still, when the door slammed shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. And in it, her doubts grew louder. What if Carson had already decided she was expendable? Back at his penthouse, Carson stood at the window, the city sprawling beneath him in fractured lights. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. Every second Estella remained out of his reach was another crack in his armor. Andre entered quietly. We found a lead. A warehouse at the edge of the docks. Could be nothing. Carson turned, his eyes burning with fury and something deeper. It won't be nothing. Andre hesitated. Carson, if you do this, you're risking everything. I think they want you desperate. They want you to make mistakes. Carson stepped closer, his voice low but seething. They made the mistake. They touched her. His fists clenched at his sides. And now I'll burn their empire to ash. Andre held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded grimly. Then let's move. For Estella, the hours stretched into eternity. She whispered prayers into the dark, her throat raw, her body aching. She thought of her mother, fragile and waiting, not knowing if she would ever return. She thought of Geneva, who had warned her. And she thought of Carson, storm-gray eyes, unreadable voice, the strange gravity that pulled her close even when she resisted. Was he coming? Or was she nothing more than a pawn sacrificed in a larger game? Her heart broke under the weight of the question. Bound, bruised, alone, Estella faced the darkest hour of her life, uncertain if the man who had chosen her once would choose her again when everything hung in the balance. If you were Estella, tied, threatened, and told the man who chose you would never come, would you keep believing in him or would you surrender to despair? The blindfold was yanked from Estella's eyes with a cruel snap, and light burned into her vision. She squinted, her wrists raw from the ropes binding her. The dim warehouse smelled of oil and rust, shadows stretching across walls scarred with bullet holes. When her gaze cleared, her breath caught. Pierce stood before her. Her shock tumbled into words before she could swallow them. You. His grin was sharp, amused by her realization. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Who else would dare to touch what Carson claims? Estella's stomach twisted. Why me? Why drag me into this? Pierce leaned closer, crouching until his face hovered just inches from hers. His cologne stung her nose, his smile cruel. Because you are the thread in his perfect tapestry, Carson Vale, the untouchable king, the cold ruler who never bends, until you. You make him bleed, Estella. And when he bleeds, he falls. Her pulse hammered. She wanted to scream at him, to deny it, but his words struck deep. Pierce chuckled at her silence. Carson ruined my family, he said, his voice dipping low. Stripped my father's empire piece by piece until nothing was left but ashes. He left us scrambling in shadows while he built his throne on our bones. I've waited years for a crack in his armor. And then I saw you, the Usher who made him flinch. Estella lifted her chin despite the terror clawing at her. If you think I'll be your weapon, you're wrong. Pierce's smile widened. You don't need to be my weapon, just his weakness. Across the city, Carson was pacing like a caged animal in his penthouse. The city lights fractured beneath him. His men kept their distance, whispers rising and falling like a storm he couldn't stop. It was Geneva who broke through. She burst into the room with fury in her eyes, pushing past Andre despite his protests. Her voice rang sharp. You let her get taken. Carson turned, his gaze like steel, but Geneva didn't flinch. Do you even care? Or was she just another pawn in your endless war? His jaw tightened. She's not a pawn. Then prove it, Geneva snapped. She threw something onto the table, a small notebook, battered from use. She wrote in this, for weeks, notes about the jobs she took, her fears, her plans to keep her mother alive. Every word bleeds desperation, Carson. And yet she still found space to write about you. How your eyes unsettled her. How she wanted to believe you weren't as cold as they said. Carson's breath caught, though his face barely shifted. He opened the notebook, scanning Estella's handwriting. The words hit harder than bullets. She had doubted him, feared him, but beneath it all, she had hoped for something more. Carson's hand tightened on the pages until his knuckles whitened. Andre's voice broke the silence. Carson, this is exactly what Pierce wants, to pull you off balance, to make you reckless. But Carson wasn't listening. The ice he had carried his whole life cracked wide, something raw spilling out. He had spent years believing love was weakness, a noose around the neck. Yet here he was, unraveling, and for the first time he understood. Weakness wasn't loving her. Weakness would be letting her go. He lifted his head, storm-gray eyes burning with a fire none of them had seen before. Gather everyone, he ordered. His voice was steady, but it thrummed with something dangerous. Every man, every resource. I don't care what rules we break. We're getting her back. Andre hesitated. Carson, this is war. You'll be tearing apart the order you built. Carson stepped closer, his jaw set. Then let it burn. She is worth more than the empire. Geneva's eyes softened, surprise flickering through her anger. In that moment, she knew he wasn't lying. For all his ruthlessness, Carson Vale would tear his kingdom to the ground if it meant Estella lived. Back in the warehouse. Estella sat straighter despite the ropes cutting into her wrists. Her heart raced, but her voice didn't tremble. You'll never win, Pierce, she said. Carson will come for me. Pierce laughed, low and cruel. That's exactly what I'm counting on. But she smiled faintly, surprising herself as much as him. Then you've already lost, because you don't understand him like I do. For the first time, Pierce's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing. Estella clung to that flicker of doubt, her only weapon. She might be bound, but her defiance could still cut. Carson stood before his men hours later, Andre at his side, Geneva watching from the shadows. His voice carried like thunder. For years, I built this empire on discipline, on control, on never letting anyone close enough to see me bleed. But Estella changed that. She isn't my weakness. She's my strength. And I will burn down anyone who touches her. The room fell silent, his men watching their untouchable leader break every rule he had ever lived by. For the first time, they didn't see a fortress of ice. They saw fire, and they followed it. Would you risk everything for someone who became your weakness, even if it meant burning down the world you built? The night air clung heavy with salt and smoke as Carson stood in the middle of his penthouse study, fury burning through every vein. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. His world was unraveling, but not in the way Pierce thought. It wasn't weakness driving him. It was rage sharpened into something deadly. Andre entered, his expression carved in stone. We broke one of Pierce's lieutenants. He cracked under the heat. They've got her at the East Docks in one of the old warehouses. It's a trap, Carson. He wants you there. Carson's storm gray eyes lifted, glinting like steel. Then he's going to get me. And when I leave, Pierce won't. Andre hesitated, the weight of the words hanging between them. If you do this, you're not just waging war. You're tearing apart the order you built. Carson's jaw flexed. Let it burn. My empire means nothing if she's gone. The docks loomed under a fractured moon, the water lapping black and restless against the pylons. The warehouse crouched at the end of the pier, its windows glowing faintly with the movements of men inside. Dozens of guards stalked the perimeter, their rifles gleaming beneath floodlights. Carson's men fanned out in silence, shadows slipping between shadows. Andre's voice was a low growl in his earpiece. On your word. Carson inhaled once, steadying the fire in his chest. Now. The night erupted. Gunfire shattered the silence, bursts of light flickering like lightning across the docks. Carson moved like a storm, precise and merciless, cutting down anyone in his path. His men drove the perimeter back, smoke filling the air as bodies hit the ground. He didn't slow. Every step was for her. Every bullet was carved from his vow to bring her home. Inside, Estella had been bracing for this moment. Pierce circled her like a wolf, his gun glinting beneath the single hanging bulb. She sat bound to the chair, wrists raw, but her eyes were steady. You really thought he'd come, Pierce sneered. Carson Vale doesn't bleed for anyone. You're nothing but bait. Estella's voice trembled, but did not break. Funny. You sound nervous for a man who claims he's already won. Pierce froze, his smirk faltering for a beat. The sounds of the gunfight outside grew louder, closer. Estella seized the crack in his armor. She shifted her weight and shoved her chair back hard, smashing into his legs. The impact made him stumble, his gun hand jerking wide. You little... But the door burst open. Carson stormed in, flanked by Andre, his fury lighting the room like fire. His gun leveled instantly on Pierce. Let her go! Pierce yanked Estella upright, his arm clamped around her throat, the muzzle of his gun pressing into her temple. His voice was mocking but strained. One more step and she dies. And then what, Vale? You'll have lost your empire for nothing. Carson's chest heaved, his storm gray eyes locked on Estella's. And for the first time, she saw him falter, not from fear of Pierce, but from fear of losing her. Then Estella moved. She stomped down on Pierce's foot with all her strength, slamming her head back into his jaw. The impact startled him enough to loosen his grip. In that heartbeat, Carson fired. The bullet struck true. Pierce staggered, crimson blooming across his chest. But even as he fell, his fingers squeezed the trigger. The shot tore across Carson's side. He staggered, breath ripping from him, but he stayed on his feet. Blood soaked his shirt, but his gun never wavered. He fired again, and Pierce collapsed for good. His body sprawled lifeless on the warehouse floor. Estella broke free of the ropes and ran to Carson, catching his weight as he swayed. No, stay with me, she cried, pressing her hands to the wound. Don't you dare fall, Carson. His breath came ragged, but his gaze softened, burning through the pain. I told you. I don't let go. Tears streaked her cheeks as she held him tighter. Then fight. For us. Not for your empire. For us. Something raw surged inside him, stronger than pain, stronger than blood loss. He straightened, clutching her hand, his voice hoarse but resolute. Always. Together, they staggered toward the door as Andre cleared the last of the guards, the gunfire fading into silence. Dawn bled across the water as Carson's men secured the docks. The war was over. Pierce was dead. Carson stood bloodied but unbroken, Estella at his side. He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers, his voice low, steady, unguarded. "You're not my possession," he murmured. "You're my equal, my strength, my everything." Estella's chest ached, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "Then let's walk forward together. No more cages, no more masks." His lips curved, faint but real, and in that fragile dawn light, Carson Vale, the untouchable king, the fortress of ice, finally bent. Not to an enemy, not to an empire, but to her. Would you risk everything, your power, your life, your empire, for someone who began as your weakness but became your strength? The days after the docks blurred into weeks. The war was over, Pierce nothing more than a shadow in the city's history, but the scars of it lingered. For Estella, healing began not in Carson's penthouse, but in a small, sunlit room that smelled faintly of lavender and medicine. Her mother. Carson had spared no expense in arranging care, nurses to tend her, a doctor who checked in regularly, medicine that was no longer rationed but plentiful. Estella stood at the bedside, her mother's frail hand wrapped in hers, tears stinging her eyes at the sight of color returning to her mother's cheeks. For the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like a question mark hanging over them. It felt like a promise. When she turned, Carson was there in the doorway. He didn't speak, didn't intrude, just stood with his storm-gray eyes softer than she had ever seen them, as if watching her here was worth more than all the power in his empire. Later, as the city lights glittered beneath the penthouse windows, Estella found him alone in the study. He sat with a glass of bourbon untouched at his elbow, his shoulders tense, as though even victory could not strip the weight from his frame. She crossed the room quietly, slipping into the seat opposite him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence thick with everything unspoken. Finally, Carson broke it. His voice was low, unsteady in a way she had never heard before. "I don't know how to do this, Estella. I've spent my life building walls, keeping everyone out. But with you?" He shook his head, his gaze dropping to the floor. "With you, I can't keep them standing. You've made me human again, and it terrifies me." Her chest ached. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. "Carson." His eyes lifted, raw and unguarded. "I love you." The words hung heavy, almost foreign on his tongue, but true. "I didn't expect to. I didn't want to. But I do. And I don't know if I can ever let you go." Tears blurred her vision, but her smile trembled through them. "I love you too." Her hand tightened around his, fierce and steady. "And thank you, and for choosing me. That night at the gala, I thought you'd destroyed my life, but you gave me a new one instead." For the first time, Carson's lips curved into a smile that wasn't sharp, wasn't dangerous, just real. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, his hand cradling her cheek with a tenderness no one else would believe of him. "You were never prey, Estella," he whispered. "You were the fire I didn't know I needed." Weeks later, they walked together into a new world. The gala halls where she had once been invisible were behind her now. She was no longer the usher clutching cards, praying to remain unseen. She walked hand in hand with Carson Vale, the man the city once called untouchable, the king who had built his empire on fear. But beside her, his hand was warm. His gaze was steady. And the man no one thought could love had chosen her, not as his possession, but as his partner. Estella lifted her chin, no longer hiding, no longer trembling. The girl who once feared the lion's den now stood with the lion at her side, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. "Do you believe love can truly change even the most dangerous man?"